The first time I realized our daughter hadn't sent us on a vacation was when the check-in clerk smiled and said, "Just the one way today?" And my chest went cold. My wife, Lenora, stiffened beside me, fingers tight around her tote like it was the last solid thing in the world. I leaned in and asked, "Careful and quiet. There's no return date on this booking?" And the clerk's eyes flicked to the screen before she answered, "No return segment, no round trip. It's booked as one way." The port around us was loud with laughter and rolling suitcases, sunlight bouncing off the water like it was celebrating something I didn't consent to. Lenora whispered, "That can't be right." But her voice had that thin edge it gets when she's trying not to crack in public. Our daughter, Brinna, insisted on driving us herself, but she dropped us at the curb with a quick hug that felt rushed and slippery, then said she couldn't stay and disappeared into traffic. I stood there, watching the ship huge, gleaming, confident, and I realized it wasn't a gift. It was a shove with wrapping paper. I wanted to call Brinna right then, to demand an explanation, but something in me hesitated, like my pride was holding my wrist. At 62, you learn a strange kind of patience, the kind that comes from surviving enough disappointments to recognize the shape of a new one before it fully arrives. And in that moment, I recognized it perfectly. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Lenora looked up at me with those steady eyes of hers, the ones that have seen layoffs, funerals, and family holidays where the smiles didn't reach anybody's heart. I swallowed hard and said, "All right," not because I accepted it, but because I suddenly understood I needed to watch carefully before I moved. Lenora's mouth tightened, and she nodded once, like she'd made a decision without saying it out loud. I pulled out my phone, opened the booking details, and saw Brinna's email attached to everything like a signature at the bottom of a sentence meant to end us. And right there in the fine print, I noticed something else that told me this wasn't panic or a mistake, this was planned. 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from Brinna that didn't ask if we were okay. It told us what we were supposed to do next. Brinna's message wasn't long, which somehow made it worse, because short sentences mean someone has already decided not to explain themselves. She wrote, "Everything is arranged. Just enjoy the cruise. You deserve it." Like she was talking to children who'd been promised ice cream, not two adults who paid mortgages and raised a family. I read it twice, then a third time, as if a hidden apology might appear between the lines if I stared long enough. Lenora leaned over my shoulder, squinting the way she does when she forgets her reading glasses, then sighed and said, "Well, at least she didn't add a smiley face." That almost made me laugh. The kind of dry laugh that sneaks out when the alternative is saying something you can't take back in public. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, then dropped the phone entirely when my fingers cramped, because apparently betrayal also comes with arthritis. Around us, people were boarding in cheerful lines, arguing about cabin numbers and drink packages, and I couldn't help thinking how unfair it was that their biggest problem was whether the buffet stayed open late. Lenora suggested we sit down for a minute. So we perched on our suitcases like two pensioners guarding picnic baskets, pretending this was all part of the plan. I caught my reflection in the terminal glass and barely recognized the man staring back, older, smaller somehow, wearing the same jacket I'd worn to my last birthday dinner with Brinna. That dinner came back to me suddenly. How she'd insisted on paying, how she'd kept checking her watch, how she'd said, "We should talk later," and never did. It hit me then that this cruise wasn't generosity. It was avoidance dressed up as care. Lenora murmured, "Do you feel like we're being put somewhere?" And I knew exactly what she meant, because the thought had been scratching at me too. I told her no, of course, because a husband lies sometimes to keep his wife upright, not to deceive her. But inside, something sour was spreading, a quiet fear mixed with anger, the kind that settles deep instead of burning out fast. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, my hands shook just enough that I had to stuff them into my pockets. And as we joined the line, I realized this wasn't just about a cruise anymore. It was about what Brinna had already decided we no longer were. Once we stepped onto the ship, the doors closed behind us with a soft mechanical sigh that sounded far too final for my liking. A young crew member welcomed us aboard with the kind of enthusiasm only someone under 30 can maintain before noon, and handed me a plastic card like it was a key to paradise, instead of a reminder that we were now officially contained. Lenora asked which way to the elevators, and I answered confidently while leading us in the wrong direction, because stress apparently flips my internal compass upside down. We ended up in front of a row of slot machines blinking like they were mocking us. And Lenora muttered, "Well, if we're being exiled, at least we can lose money doing it," which earned a sharp look from a passing security guard. I tried to smile, but my jaw felt tight, the way it does when I bite down on words I don't want anyone else to hear. As we finally found our cabin, I noticed it wasn't small or shabby. It was comfortable, clean, even thoughtful, which somehow made everything hurt more. This wasn't neglect, it was strategy. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt it dip under my weight. And for a moment my knees complained louder than my heart, which felt like a betrayal all its own. Lenora unpacked quietly, lining up her shoes like she always does, as if keeping order in one small place could keep the rest of the world from slipping sideways. I opened the closet and found a welcome note, with our names printed neatly, and I wondered how long Brinna had planned this while smiling across our kitchen table. My phone buzzed again, and my chest tightened until I saw it wasn't her, just a notification reminding me to activate the onboard app, because apparently even confusion needs a password now. I sat there thinking about all the times Brinna had told us we were too much, too worried, too present, too opinionated, and how tired she'd sounded saying it. At 62, you start hearing words differently, not for what they say, but for what they're trying to push away. I told Lenora we'd give it a day, maybe two, because part of me still hoped this was some poorly executed surprise, not a quiet dismissal. But as the ship's horn sounded low and deep, vibrating through the walls like a warning, I felt something settle inside me that wasn't patience anymore. It was the understanding that whatever Brinna thought she had sent away hadn't actually gone anywhere yet. That first evening on the ship was supposed to feel like freedom, but instead it felt like being politely escorted out of our own lives. We went to dinner because hunger doesn't care about emotional shock, and also because Lenora has always believed that skipping meals only makes bad situations worse. The dining room was elegant in that carefully planned way, all soft lights and quiet music, and I immediately knocked my spoon onto the floor just to remind the universe I was still myself. The waiter bent down to pick it up before I could, smiling kindly, and I muttered thanks while thinking how strange it felt to be helped by strangers instead of our own child. Lenora ordered something healthy, I ordered something heavy, and halfway through chewing I realized my appetite was running on stubbornness alone. Around us, people chatted about excursions and anniversaries, about how long they'd waited for this trip, and every laugh felt slightly out of sync with my insides. I caught myself wondering if Brinna imagined us blending into this crowd, becoming background noise in someone else's vacation slideshow. My phone stayed silent on the table, face up, like it was daring me to stop expecting anything from it. I told Lenora a joke about how at least on a ship, nobody could ask me to help move furniture, and she smiled politely, but her eyes stayed serious. She asked, very calmly, what we would do if this really was one way. And that question landed harder than anything Brinna had written. I thought about our house, our routines, the chair by the window that squeaks when I sit down just right, and felt a slow heat crawl up my spine. I said we'd figure it out, because that's what men my age are trained to say, even when we don't have a map. Later, back in the cabin, I tried calling Brinna, and it rang long enough to make Hope uncomfortable before dropping into voicemail. I didn't leave a message, because I suddenly understood that chasing her would only make this easier for her to ignore. As the ship rocked gently beneath us, I lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds, and realized this wasn't exile by accident. It was distance designed to feel generous, and that made me quietly, dangerously angry. The next morning I woke up before dawn, not because I was rested, but because my body still thinks problems are best handled early, preferably with coffee and silence. I shuffled toward the tiny coffee station, pressed the wrong button, and sprayed hot water onto my sock, which felt like the ship itself was warning me to pay attention. Lenora slept on, curled toward the window, and for a moment I envied her ability to escape into dreams while I stood there negotiating with a paper cup. When I finally sat down, the ocean outside looked endless and calm, and that calmness felt insulting, like it had no respect for what was happening to us. I opened the cruise app and started scrolling, Not because I cared about bingo or wine tastings, but because I needed proof that this situation had an end date somewhere. There wasn't one. No return reminders, no countdown home, just an open calendar smiling back at me like we'd signed up for disappearing. At breakfast, Lenora tried to joke about how at least nobody here knew our history, and I nodded, but inside I felt stripped, like anonymity was being forced on us. A couple at the next table asked how long we were sailing, and I answered, long enough to find out who we are, which earned a confused laugh I didn't bother correcting. I excused myself and walked the deck, gripping the rail harder than necessary, feeling the vibration of the engines under my palms. That vibration stirred something in me, memories of long shifts, overtime hours, years spent fixing other people's problems while trusting my daughter to handle her own conscience. I realized then how carefully Brynner had framed this. Not abandonment, but care. Not distance, but rest. It was clever in a way that hurt, because it meant she'd learned how to avoid guilt without actually facing us. When I called her again, she didn't answer, but this time, she sent a message a few minutes later saying she was busy and we should enjoy the view. I stared at the words until they blurred, then laughed softly to myself, because even now, she was telling me where to look instead of listening to what I was saying. Back in the cabin, Lenora asked if everything was fine, and I said yes, because admitting otherwise felt like letting something break too soon. But as I watched the shoreline disappear completely, I understood something with a clarity that scared me. If this was how she planned to move us out of the way, then she had badly underestimated how much weight two quiet people can still carry. By the third day, the ship had settled into its routine, and so had my irritation, which is a dangerous thing because routine makes anger patient. I tried one of the morning stretch classes, mostly because the brochure promised it was gentle, and mostly because my knees now require negotiation before noon. The instructor called me sir about 8 times in 10 minutes, which somehow felt respectful and dismissive at the same time. When she told us to release tension, I almost laughed out loud, because if I knew how to do that, I wouldn't be standing on a floating city wearing borrowed calm. Lenora waved at me from a chair nearby, pretending not to notice when I nearly tipped over trying to balance on one foot. And that small familiar embarrassment grounded me more than the exercise ever could. Later, while she napped, I sat alone with my phone and finally opened Brynner's email history, scrolling back months, then a year, watching the tone slowly change. Fewer questions, shorter replies, more phrases like, we'll see, and I'll handle it, as if we'd become another task on her list. I remembered the last time we visited her house, how she'd flinched when I mentioned fixing a loose cabinet hinge, like my presence itself was maintenance she didn't want scheduled. That memory pressed down on me harder than the ocean air, and I felt something bend inside, not snap, just bend far enough to change shape. I realized then that humiliation doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in courtesy and leaves you smiling while it rearranges your spine. That afternoon, I asked guest services about extending our stay in port on the next stop, and the clerk cheerfully explained our itinerary was flexible, which meant movable, not reversible. I thanked her and walked away slowly, because I didn't trust my voice to behave. At dinner, Lenora noticed my silence and squeezed my hand under the table, a quiet question she didn't force me to answer. I wanted to tell her everything I'd figured out, but part of me needed to finish breaking alone before I could speak clearly. So I smiled, made a joke about dessert portions getting smaller as we got older, and waited. Because somewhere between the stretching mats and the polite emails, my anger had stopped asking for permission. That night, while Lenora slept, I made a decision I didn't announce. And by morning, it would start moving things Brynner assumed were already settled. The morning I finally told Lenora the truth, my voice came out steadier than I felt, which is how you know something inside has already hardened. We were sitting near the railing with weak ship coffee and a plate of pastries neither of us should have been eating, pretending this was just another quiet retirement morning. I said, this wasn't a gift, and waited, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is not rush the moment someone's world shifts. Lenora didn't interrupt, didn't defend Brynner, didn't soften it for me, and that silence told me she had already walked this road in her head. I explained what I'd seen in the emails, the missing return plans, the careful language, and how everything pointed to one simple idea. We were meant to stay out of the way. She nodded slowly and said, "I thought it was strange she asked about our wills last spring, and that sentence hit me harder than the ocean breeze." I laughed once, short and sharp, because apparently denial had been charging interest behind our backs. Lenora joked that, at least if we vanished at sea, Brenna wouldn't have to explain it at family dinners, and we both laughed too long for that to be healthy. Then her face changed, the humor draining out, and she said, "But she forgot something," and I asked what. "She forgot we raised her," Lenora replied, calm as a settled verdict. That was the moment my quiet anger finally found its spine, because she was right, we weren't helpless cargo. We were the people who taught Brenna how plans work. I told Lenora I'd already started calling our lawyer, a man named Roland Pike, who still answers his phone like time hasn't conquered him yet. Her eyebrows lifted, impressed and a little amused, and she said, "So this is you being calm?" I admitted this was me being controlled, which at my age is as close to calm as things get. We talked about our house, our accounts, our documents, all the dull adult things that suddenly felt like armor instead of chores. For the first time since boarding, Lenora's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, like she'd been waiting for me to stop absorbing and start acting. As we stood up to leave, I knocked my knee into the table and muttered something unflattering about ship design. And Lenora smiled at me, the way she does when she knows I'm back. That afternoon, while the ocean kept pretending nothing mattered, I made calls, took notes, and quietly reclaimed pieces of our life Brenna assumed were already boxed up. By sunset, I understood this cruise wasn't removing us from the story at all. It was simply the place where our daughter's certainty began to unravel.
I had known something was wrong long before anyone at that port said the words "one way," because a mother feels silence before it becomes a sentence. When the clerk explained the tickets, I didn't panic out loud. I felt something colder settle in my chest, the kind of understanding that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. My husband stood very straight beside me, which is always how I know he's holding something back, and I let him, because after 40 years, you learn when to give a man space to think. On the ship, while everyone else admired sunsets and railings, I started noticing details instead. How Brenna hadn't packed a return envelope for our house keys. How she'd rushed the goodbye. How she'd said, "You'll be fine," instead of "we'll see you soon." Those are small differences, but motherhood trains you to read small things like warning signs. The first night, when my husband pretended to be fascinated by the TV remote and pressed the wrong button 3 times, I knew he was stalling, and I let him because pride needs time to bruise properly. I unpacked our clothes carefully, folding everything the way I always do, not because it mattered here, but because routine keeps fear from spilling everywhere. I joked about how the bed was softer than ours at home and how that alone might be suspicious, and he smiled in that polite way men do when they're listening but not hearing. By the second day, I started thinking about our daughter differently, not as a child who made a mistake, but as an adult who made a decision. That distinction hurts more than anger, because mistakes invite forgiveness, but decisions demand response. I sat on the deck watching couples hold hands and wondered how many of them had sent someone away so they wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable anymore. When my husband finally told me what he'd found in the emails, I wasn't shocked. I was relieved, because uncertainty is heavier than truth. I told him about the questions Brenna had asked months ago about paperwork, about simplifying things, about whether we were tired, and I watched his face tighten as the pattern snapped into place. We laughed, dark and dry, about how thoughtful she'd been, how generous, how modern, and that laughter tasted like iron. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, not gently, but firmly, the way you do when you're reminding someone they're still here. Inside, though, something else was waking up. Something older than motherhood and stronger than disappointment. Because if our daughter thought I was ready to disappear quietly, she had badly misunderstood who she sent onto that ship. Once I allowed myself to see the situation clearly, small memories began lining up like receipts I'd shoved into a drawer and ignored. Brenna's sudden interest in our documents, the way she'd asked whether we'd considered downsizing, the careful tone she used whenever she talked about our future, as if it were already a separate room she didn't plan to enter. On the ship, I watched my husband pretend to read the daily schedule while holding it upside down, and I didn't correct him, because dignity sometimes needs a moment to catch its breath. We attended a trivia game one afternoon, and when the host asked a question about classic films, my husband answered confidently and completely wrong, then shrugged and said, "Well, it was a long time ago," which earned polite laughter and eased the knot in my chest just a little. I realized then how good he was at surviving embarrassment without letting it turn into bitterness, and that reminded me why I trusted him now. I started making my own calls, quietly, carefully, during times when the ship's signal was strongest and the ocean seemed least interested in interfering. I spoke to our bank, to an old friend who still lived near our house, and to my sister-in-law who never forgets a detail even when she pretends not to listen. Each conversation confirmed what I suspected. Brenna had been rearranging things at home while we were packing sunscreen. Not selling, not stealing, nothing dramatic enough to feel criminal, but shifting, positioning, preparing for a future where we were less present. That kind of planning takes confidence. And confidence like that usually comes from believing no one will push back. I told my husband what I'd learned while we shared a plate of overcooked fish, and he nodded slowly, absorbing it without interruption, the way he always does when he's already 10 steps ahead. He tried to lighten the mood by joking that at least the ship laundry folded better than I did, which was both untrue and unnecessary but appreciated. I reminded him that I had kept this family running while he worked overtime, and that I was not about to retire from awareness now. That night, as the ship cut through dark water, I lay awake listening to the low hum of engines and felt something settle into place. This wasn't just about being sent away. It was about being underestimated. And the moment someone underestimates you, that's when you decide exactly how visible you're going to become. The turning point came quietly, the way serious decisions often do, disguised as an ordinary morning with weak coffee and too much thinking. I watched my husband struggle with the sugar packets, tearing 3 before one finally cooperated. And I thought about how many years I had watched this same man fix problems far bigger than paper and pride. After breakfast, I asked him to walk with me along the deck. Not because I needed fresh air, but because I needed space where the truth could sit between us without interruption. I told him I had spoken to the bank, to our neighbor Ellis, who never misses a delivery, and to my sister-in-law June, who remembers dates better than calendars. I explained how Brenna had redirected mail, paused certain services, and told people we were traveling for a while, as if our lives had suddenly become a rumor. My husband stopped walking, leaned on the railing, and for a second I saw that flicker of hurt he tries so hard to keep hidden. The one that says a line has been crossed. He asked me calmly what I thought we should do, and that question mattered more to me than any apology ever could. I told him we were going home, not immediately, not dramatically, but deliberately, with our names still attached to everything that mattered. He laughed once and said, "I suppose I should stop pretending this is a vacation," and I told him he'd never been good at pretending anyway. We went to guest services together, and when the clerk chirped about flexible arrangements, I smiled politely and asked very specific questions that required very real answers. My husband stood beside me nodding, occasionally adding a comment about his knees or the chairs, which softened the moment just enough to keep things civil. By the time we left the desk, we had timelines, contacts, and options, and I felt something lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized was crushing me. That afternoon I sent Brenna a message, not angry, not pleading, just clear, telling her we would be returning sooner than expected and that we needed to talk. She replied hours later with a vague response about stress and misunderstanding, and I read it twice before handing the phone back without comment. Somewhere between that message and the horizon sliding past us, I understood that control doesn't come from shouting. It comes from refusing to stay where someone else put you. And from that moment on, every calm step we took forward began to feel like pressure building somewhere Brenna hadn't planned for at all. The first real confrontation didn't happen face to face, and somehow that made it sharper, like a letter opener instead of a knife. Brenna finally called that evening, her voice overly careful, the way people sound when they're already rehearsing how they'll be misunderstood. She asked how we were enjoying the cruise, stretching the word enjoying until it almost snapped, and I let her finish before answering. I told her calmly that we had discovered the tickets were one way and asked her why she hadn't mentioned that detail. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the faint echo of her television in the background, which told me exactly how seriously she'd expected this call to be. She said she thought it would be easier for us not to worry about coming back right away, and I almost smiled at the word easier because it always means easier for someone else. My husband sat beside me, nodding, rubbing his knee in that absent way he does when he's holding himself steady. And I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it surprised even me. I reminded Brenna that we still had a home, responsibilities, and lives that didn't pause just because she found them inconvenient. She tried to soften it with humor, saying we were finally getting the rest we deserved, and my husband quietly muttered that his back disagreed, which almost made me laugh. Then her tone changed, just slightly, and she said she had already made some adjustments, assuming we'd be gone longer. That was the moment the conversation stopped being emotional and became factual. I told her we would be returning, that nothing had been signed away, and that any assumptions she'd made would need to be undone. She accused us of overreacting, of refusing help, of clinging to control, and I listened patiently because accusations lose their power when you don't rush to defend yourself. I told her we weren't clinging to control, we were reclaiming it. When the call ended, my hands were steady, but my heart was racing, and my husband looked at me with a mix of admiration and concern. I joked that motherhood apparently doesn't come with a retirement plan, and he smiled, but his eyes were already focused forward, because now the lines were drawn, not in anger, but in certainty, and certainty has a way of frightening people who thought they were done negotiating. After that call, the air between my husband and me felt different, heavier but cleaner, like a room after a long overdue argument finally ends. He tried to make tea and forgot to put water in the kettle, stared at it, humming uselessly, then said, "Well, that explains why it's taking so long," and I laughed harder than the joke deserved. That laugh mattered, because it reminded us we were still ourselves, not fragile cargo waiting to be stored somewhere convenient. But underneath the humor sat a very real fear, one we didn't rush to name. What exactly had Brenna already touched back home? I spent the afternoon on the phone again, my notebook open, writing things down the way I used to when the kids were small and chaos needed lines and lists. Our neighbor Ellis confirmed the mail change, and June mentioned Brenna had asked about storage units, just in case, which made my stomach tighten in a slow, deliberate way. Nothing was gone, nothing destroyed, but things were in motion. And motion without consent is a kind of theft that doesn't show up on statements. When I told my husband, he went very quiet, the way he does when anger turns inward before it comes back out as resolve. He joked that at least nobody could put us in a storage unit without noticing the noise, and I reminded him his knees alone would trigger an investigation. That evening, we sat side by side watching the ocean go dark, and I felt the weight of how close we'd come to being erased politely. I thought about how many parents our age accept these shifts without question, mistaking pressure for love, convenience for care. I told my husband that even if this got uncomfortable, even if voices were raised back home, we could not retreat now. He nodded and said he hadn't worked 40 years to be managed out of his own life by someone who still called him for advice. Later, a message came in from Brenna, sharper this time, warning us not to complicate things, and I felt something harden behind my ribs. I replied once, carefully, stating that complications already existed, and we intended to face them in person. When I set the phone down, my hands were no longer shaking, which told me we had crossed an important line. Because when fear stops shaking you, it means determination has taken over, and it does not step aside easily. The days that followed felt like standing in the calm center of a storm you know is heading toward land, slow but unavoidable. My husband became almost methodical, waking early, making lists, crossing things out, then rewriting them larger, because his handwriting shrinks when he's angry. One morning he put his shirt on inside out, didn't notice until lunch, and shrugged when I pointed it out, saying, "At my age, people assume it's a style choice." And for a moment, we laughed like teenagers getting away with something. But the humor never stayed long, because every notification carried weight now, every vibration of the phone felt like a test of nerves. Brenna started calling more frequently, not to apologize, but to manage, asking what time we planned to return, suggesting alternatives, hinting at how difficult things had become without us there. I listened carefully, hearing the strain creep into her voice, the subtle panic that comes when a plan begins slipping out of obedient silence. I told her we had secured return arrangements and that we expected everything at home to be exactly as we left it, and she responded with a sharp breath she forgot to hide. My husband overheard one call and later joked that she sounded like a project manager whose timeline had just been rejected, and I smiled despite myself. Underneath that smile was the understanding that we were no longer being treated as parents, but as variables she had failed to control. I reviewed our documents one last time, rereading clauses I'd skimmed for years, and felt a strange pride realizing how much protection had been quietly built into our life. We weren't wealthy, we weren't powerful, but we weren't careless either, and that mattered now more than ever. That evening, as the ship prepared for its next stop, my husband squeezed my hand and asked if I was ready for what waited back home. I told him I was ready for truth, and if truth caused discomfort, that was no longer our burden to carry alone. He nodded, then immediately bumped his elbow on the railing, and muttered about ships being designed by younger people, which grounded us both again. As the lights of the distant shore appeared, I felt something settle firmly in my chest, not fear, not anger, but certainty. Because once you stop accepting the role someone assigns you, the entire story is forced to change, whether they like it or not. When we finally stepped back onto solid ground, I expected to feel tired, but instead I felt clear, like a woman who had set something straight inside herself. My husband took one careful step off the gangway, paused to stretch his back, and said, "Next time we travel, I'm choosing the tickets," which felt like a promise more than a joke. We didn't rush home. We moved deliberately, checking doors, papers, accounts, confirming with our own eyes that our life was still ours. Everything important was intact, and that alone felt like a quiet victory Brenna hadn't anticipated. When she finally came over, her confidence was gone, replaced by that restless energy people have when they realize they pushed too far. She talked quickly, explaining intentions, stress, misunderstandings, and I let her, because sometimes people need to hear themselves before they hear anyone else. Then I told her calmly that care does not mean control, and love does not involve removing someone's choices without consent. My husband added, gently but firmly, that we were not problems to be managed or items to be relocated, and his voice didn't shake once. Brenna cried, not dramatically but quietly, and for the first time she listened instead of planning her next move. We didn't threaten, we didn't punish, and we didn't retreat. We set boundaries, like people who intended to stay present. Later that evening, my husband burned dinner because he forgot it in the oven while reorganizing his files, and we ate it anyway, laughing at the smoke alarm like it was applause. Sitting there, in our own kitchen, with our routines slightly scorched but still standing, I felt proud in a way that had nothing to do with winning. We hadn't broken, we hadn't disappeared, and we hadn't been quietly rewritten out of our own story. We had stood our ground without shouting, without cruelty, and without asking permission. And that, at our age, felt like the strongest kind of triumph there is.